Good evening and welcome to SVPMA's September 2022 meeting. This evening's speaker is Ravi Mehta, and he's here to talk about the shape of product management. Take it away, Ravi.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to be with all of you. I'm also happy to hear that you're going to be getting together in person. I'm based in LA, so I won't be able to join, but it's really nice that we're starting to get back to those sorts of things. So great to meet everyone. I'm going to talk about a product competency framework that I released a couple of years ago that was really helpful to me as I was thinking about my own product career and as I was helping others think about their product career. And so I'm excited to share that with you today. We've got a good sized group to have a good conversation. So feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to put stuff in chat. I'll pause every once in a while for questions. I have a couple of questions for you as we go through this together. So definitely don't be shy about jumping in as questions or thoughts or ideas come up. I think this is most useful if we can learn from each other. So we're going to talk about this competency framework and think about how to grow your skills so that you can really understand what makes you a uniquely great product manager, and how to think about the skills on your team so that you can form a team that complements each other, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. This is a quick intro. I've been a product leader throughout my career. I fell in love with technology when I was really young. Not to date myself, but my dad brought home an Apple IIc computer in the mid 80s. There was nothing to do back then other than to learn how to program, and so I learned how to code, and I started making games, and I just fell in love with the idea of creating products for people. I did that all throughout high school. I dropped out of college for a little bit to do that full time, and then my first role out of school was I was lucky enough to join Microsoft at a really interesting moment where the company was starting to think about taking games seriously. And so I joined about a year before the Xbox team was formed. I got to be one of the early members of that team, and that really kicked off, a lifelong kind of journey as a product leader, specifically focused on consumer tech. And then the other sub-thread of my work has been I've had a consistent focus on not just consumer tech, but consumer tech that has some social elements to it. I've loved building teams throughout my career. I started at Microsoft. My most recent product leadership roles have been I was head of consumer product at TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor is where we initially developed this framework, and I can talk about the rationale behind why we developed it. I was a product director at Meta, where I was focused on Facebook and Messenger. I worked on the youth team, so I was really focused on understanding where is social media going for younger users, and how are things changing, and how might Facebook and Messenger respond to those changes. I was thinking about that both from a product strategy standpoint as well as from an M&A standpoint. Then I was the chief product officer at Tinder, where I was helping the company think about its Gen Z strategy and really helping to professionalize the product org. I left shortly before the pandemic with the goal of starting something new. I spent about a year and a half really focused on kind of writing and paying things forward. I joined a company called Reforge, which does cohort-based courses for product managers and growth professionals. And I helped them build out their product curriculum. I helped them launch their product strategy program. And then I helped them create and launch a program on product leadership. And then about a year ago, in part because of the work that I did at Reforge and some of the other work that I was doing connecting with product managers and leaders across the industry, I found a problem that I really fell in love with, which is, post-pandemic in particular, it's really clear that people are looking for more support within their professional lives. People want to be successful, but they don't always know where to go for the one-on-one advice that they need to be as successful as possible. And so, I, from my own career, have known that executive coaching can be an incredibly effective way to get the advice that you need in the moment that you need it. But unfortunately, it's not typically available to people until much later in their careers. It's not that affordable. Not a lot of people have access to it. It's hard to discover a really good executive coach. And my co-founder and I started looking at this problem space and seeing that there was a really interesting set of solutions, not directly in our problem space, but in adjacent spaces. And so if you look at what Noom has done to productize the interaction between a nutrition counselor and a person, and what Talkspace and BetterHelp are doing for therapy, and what Future is doing for personal fitness. There's some really interesting trends in terms of taking interactions that used to be one-on-one interactions between a person and a provider, and using mobile, using software to enable those transactions to happen in a much more affordable way and a more effective way. And so we created the company with that goal, which is using a very consumer-oriented, product-oriented mindset to really rethink how coaching is discovered and delivered. We launched that about a year ago. I'm happy to, at the Q&A, talk more about our experiences so far in the first year of the business in terms of fundraising, finding product market fit, and just generally getting things off the ground. So that's me. I've spent most of my career kind of going between larger companies and smaller companies, but always as a product person and primarily focused on the consumer side of things. When I started my career, I was lucky enough to start at Microsoft, which I think, even though they don't call product managers, they have a program management function. To a large degree, that program management function was the foundation on which a lot of modern product management is built. And an early mentor at Microsoft told me something that really stuck with me over the years. She said, PMs are like the mortar in a brick wall. Like mortar, you must fluidly fill the gaps between the bricks to make the whole wall stronger. That really resonated with me at the time, because it felt like, no, this isn't like a defined role. This is a role that is amorphous depending on what the team needs. And that's really fascinating and interesting to me. But it resonates even more with me today, because product, software, the various things that we're trying to optimize have just gotten so much more diverse and complicated. And so product management is a very fluid and very connective role. It's also a very demanding role, and it varies a lot from company to company. And it requires people to be great at things that are typically on opposite ends of the spectrum. You need to be ruthlessly analytical. You also need to be disruptively creative. You need to be great at the details. You also need to be a long-term strategic thinker. You need to be a great leader, someone who's going to connect the team up, down, and across, but you also need to be someone who can do deep work and can think deeply about the product. And so it is this very demanding role that requires a really broad array of skills. But the thing that really stood out to me is that no matter how you define PM, the job is really the same. And the job of a product manager is ultimately not to ship features. It's to deliver business impact. And this, to me, is sort of the fundamental first principle of product management, and what sets it apart from project management, or what sets it apart from this idea of disempowered product teams. Ultimately, really great product managers think about their work in the context not of the product itself, but in the context of the business. And they think about the product as a lever for the company to be able to achieve its objectives and for it to be able to deliver value to customers. And so great peak product managers do whatever it takes to deliver valuable outcomes for their users, their team, and their company. They do whatever it takes to deliver business impact. But delivering impact is really hard. The strongest PMs are intellectual athletes. They excel at a diverse range of mutually reinforcing skills. And so that begs the question, what are those skills? And can we define it in a way that is canonical and is really helpful to understand ourselves, the people that we're working with, and figure out what the path forward looks like, both for us and our teams? And so when I was at Microsoft, I started in 2012, or sorry, not at Microsoft, at TripAdvisor. So I started at TripAdvisor in 2012, and the company was at a really interesting point. It had been part of Expedia for a number of years. It had recently been rolled out from Expedia, and as a newly independent public company, it could start to do things strategically that it couldn't do as part of Expedia. And specifically, it could move from a very review-oriented media site to much more of a transactional marketplace. But in order to do that, we needed to grow our product team, and we needed to grow it quickly. The problem was we were based in Boston, and there were not a lot of consumer-oriented product professionals that we could tap into. And so it was taking a long time to hire product managers. It was taking anywhere between 3 and 6 months when we had an open role, and we knew that wasn't sustainable for us. And so the person that I worked for, the head of product at TripAdvisor, came up with the idea of creating a rotational program where we could hire people directly out of business school and put them through an intensive program and take someone who didn't have product management experience, and ideally in 2 years, turn them into a really great product manager who's ready for a senior product management role. I took over that program after I started. And one of the things that we needed to do in order to accomplish that was we needed to think about, well, what are the skills that someone who has never done product management before needs to excel at? And so we put together a rotational program where each person went through a 2-year program where they had 4 6-month rotations, often in different parts of the product, maybe focused on mobile or web, maybe focused on greenfield innovation or growth. And then we defined a rubric for how do we actually think about what are the skills that someone needs in order to be successful. And these 12 skills eventually became the foundation for the product competency toolkit, which I released a couple of years ago. And so this toolkit contains 12 different mutually reinforcing competencies that are essential for product managers to be successful at all levels, from APM all the way through to VP. It's organized into 4 areas: product execution, customer insight, product strategy, and influencing people. And as you can see, just by the list of skills that there is here, there's a lot to master. There's points of tension in the PM role. The role requires people to be simultaneously empathetic and analytical, qualitative and quantitative. It requires fastidious attention to detail and grand abstract thinking. The best PMs are both creative innovators and rigorous optimizers. And so there's this really broad set of things that PMs need to excel at. And the fact is, nobody's going to be great at all of these things, and understanding what we're great at is a way to enable you to create a development plan that allows you to really invest in your strengths and understand how you interface with the team and understand the right set of people to have around you so that you can be as successful as possible. So I'll go through each of the 12 competencies. The first area is product execution. So product execution is about defining, building, and launching exceptional products. There's really 3 competencies that are important as part of product execution. The first one is functional specification. And so no matter what form it takes, a really good spec rallies the team around a goal and an idea and provides enough detail that a team can take that concept and execute it flawlessly. So functional specification is about taking everything that you've learned, putting it into a format that the team can understand and execute incredibly well against. And we'll talk a little bit about the customer insight and the strategy that ultimately goes into that concept. The second thing is PMs need to focus on product delivery. They need to be able to work quickly, iteratively against predefined goals so that they can build this functional specification. And so product delivery is a matter of working with a broad set of stakeholders, being a great cross-functional leader so that you can deliver on an exceptional product. And then the third piece, which is really important, is product quality. So depending on the context, a PM won't be responsible for QA, but PMs are always responsible for the quality of the product. And quality is your product's most important feature. Without quality, your product can't deliver value to customers. And oftentimes what happens is that in the quest to add more features to a product, there's always focus on what's the next spec I got to write, what's the next feature I've got to ship. And sometimes quality can fall by the wayside. And as a result, it's this kind of seething underlying issue that can start to erode your ability to actually provide value, because no matter what features you add, if those features don't have quality, people aren't going to want to use them. And a really good example here is I met with a product leader from Spotify years ago, and he said, quality is our product's most important feature. And because of that, it's what we ship first, and then we'll add new features after we ship quality.
There you go.
And as I've used
Bingo.
Spotify, I can really, I can understand that they do that. I can't remember the last time Spotify crashed on me, the last time I waited too long for a song to start, the last time a
The
song.
last time I heard somebody say that.
Cool. Any questions? Or that's just, all right, awesome. So I'll pause there. I know I've gone through a bunch of stuff so far. I want to present the other competencies as well. But I just want to pause and see if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Jim, what's your thought?
In product execution, the feature specification one can be tricky. You got to put enough detail in there so the development team understands the problems, but there's such a thing as over specifying it.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to allow enough room for some discovery along the way, because it's really hard to capture everything the customer wants, needs, et cetera. And oftentimes they don't figure it out until they see some prototypes anyway. So I think it's important to make sure that that you don't try to capture everything ahead of time and leave yourself some room to iterate.
I completely agree with that. One of the things that I would tell new PMs at TripAdvisor is the engineering team writes the final draft of your spec. So make sure they have the context to do it well. And so that doesn't mean that you have to spec out everything, because you can't possibly spec out everything. But it does mean that the why behind the decisions is really important. So that when engineers get into the code, get into the details, they know how to connect the tissue together because they understand the rationale that went into the feature.
Yeah, focus on the why, let the developers figure out the how.
Absolutely. And let them understand the why as well. So that as they're building that how, they're thinking about it in terms of how this is eventually going to be used by customers, so that they can fill in the dots or fill in the blanks really well.
Staying in the problem space.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks.
And I've seen time and time again, like one of the best things that you can do in order to empower your engineering team, and as a result, see your engineering effort estimates go down, is put them in front of customers. As soon as they see customers using the product, it makes their work really real. It makes it really fulfilling. And then it helps them understand that this isn't an abstract piece of software that they're writing, that it's something that's going to impact a person's daily life. Vineet, what's your thought?
Yeah, Ravi, I was going to ask a follow-up question to what Jim said, the problem space versus solution space. I've seen some engineering teams where they would expect the PMs to define the sort of user experience on, how they navigate a product and what it should look like. So what's, in your opinion, where do you draw the line? Where do PMs focus on just the why, or do they also get into the solution space? I think over time, I've realized that you can't just sit on the sidelines. You have to dive into the solution space as well, as long as you've covered, the problem space well enough. So what are your thoughts and experience on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's actually a perfect cue to the next slide. I'll just go there to talk a little bit about it. But, to jump ahead, one of the things that I think is one of these core 12 competencies for product managers is user experience design. Ultimately, and this can vary depending on what you're working on, but ultimately a lot of software, both B2C software and B2C software, is visual. And so the interface that a person sees when they use your product is visual. And so it's really important for PMs to understand how the functionality that they want to create is going to get rendered into pixels. And that's not an execution thing. Sometimes it can be a strategic thing. One of the toughest things that I've seen at multiple companies that I've been at is figuring out what 4 or 5 functions are going to go on the nav bar on a mobile phone. You can't put more than 4 or 5 things there. That's not an execution question. That's a strategy question of what is your product doing for customers. And so it's really important for PMs to be steeped in user experience design. That doesn't necessarily mean that they need to do the design. They can work effectively with a design team in order to do that. But it does mean that they need to understand how the requirements of their features translates into a user experience, and does that in a way that the customer can get value from the product. And this is specifically user experience design and not user interface design. because the UI is going to be different. If you're a PM working on developer products and you're creating APIs, the user experience that developers have with your product is an API, in which case your user experience design competency needs to be focused on how do you create a UI that's really easy for developers to understand and helps them accomplish what they want using the software whose functionality you're exposing via the API. So really good question, and I think it's fundamental to the role. The specific day-to-day will vary depending on the designers that you have around yourself, other folks, depending on the type of work that you're doing, but it is a critical part of delivering value to customers. Mark, what's your question?
Pending what you just were talking about, and it's perfect for this slide, actually. So in my area, I have a lot of trouble with getting a farmer to use a user interface. So I have to get really into that UX design, that perspective of the customer. But the feedback I've been getting from my peers is that holds me back from being more strategic. They would need me to be more senior in that way. And I think your diagram starts to show a little bit of that. Talk to me more about the seniority level and the strategic versus the tactical.
Yeah, so the decision about what the UI looks like is a strategic decision. One of the examples I like to use, and I'm not sure if this is mythology or actually happened, was that the early iPhone designers showed Steve Jobs a prototype of the iPhone, and it had a bunch of buttons on it. It had a keyboard on it, like the BlackBerry at the time. And he looked at it and he says, come back when this phone has no buttons. And they came back and they couldn't get rid of all the buttons. They had to have a home button. But they were able to open up their thinking about what a phone could be as a result of that very tactical, very execution feedback that Steve Jobs gave them. But ultimately that feedback it wasn't necessarily just about the execution, the design. It was really about the strategy. And the strategy there was, let's create a phone that is mass market in a way that no phone has ever been before. That's not a mini computer, but that really rethinks what a mobility device should look like. And so my suggestion to them would be to say, look, ultimately farmers are, they're a very specific type of customer. They're going to have very specific schedules. They're going to be using the product in very specific environments. And if they can't get value from the product because they get confused by the user interface, or the user interface doesn't work within the context in which they're using it, we're falling down strategically. We're going to lose. And the history of tech is littered with companies that started to focus on their own business value at the expense of customers. And as soon as you do that, you open up yourself for disruption, and someone else will come along and really focus on those customers, do a great job of catering to those needs. And all of a sudden, what was an execution problem now turns into a strategy problem. Awesome. Great questions. Love the questions. Keep them coming. So the second area for the product competencies is customer insight. So the first is product execution. We need to be able to take a concept and execute it flawlessly. The second area is really about understanding what we need to deliver for customers. And we can't do that unless we actually understand the customers, unless we put ourselves in the seat of those farmers who are using the product, or the developers who might be using our API. And this comes down to kind of three different ways of thinking about customer insight and using that to deliver value. The first one is fluency with data. This we know really well. And we could think about product as just a really good PM will obsessively seek out the causal relationships between user behavior and valuable outcomes. And ultimately, that's the goal of data, is to understand those causal levers so that we can deliver something to customers that they get value from and that creates value for our business. And it's really important to do that with quantifiable data because of the crispness, the sharpness of the insights that you can get. And so, part of fluency with data is not just like, let's run experiments, let's throw things against the wall, let's A/B test, and then we'll pick the winners, and we'll get rid of the losers. And then over time, we'll sort of like evolve into a product that is optimal. that can work for a period of time, but what's missing there is a really fundamental idea of what are the first principles? What are customers actually engaging with, and how are they getting value from the product? And so it's not just a matter of numbers going up. It's really about being fluent with those numbers and using that as a way to fuel your insight. The second thing that's really important is voice of the customer. So the only way to truly understand and empathize with customers is to talk to them. And one of the reasons early stage companies have an advantage in this regard is they don't have data to work with. And so they have to talk to customers. And there's so few of them that you can talk to them all the time if you want to, and you can get a pretty clear picture of what's happening. But the problem is that as companies start to get bigger, this skill around talking to customers tends to atrophy. And the way that I see it happen often is that user research becomes this big, heavy thing. It's a separate group within the organization. To do a user research study requires 3 months of prep time, and it's a 6-figure investment. And then you're going to go and you're going to talk to 100 people, and then you're going to get a 300 slide deck, which is going to answer all the questions that you had for the next 6 to 9 months. And then maybe you'll get a chance to get budget approved for your next user research study. And when conversations with customers become so heavy, become such a burden, then PMs don't have the customer insight to rely on. And so they just rely on their intuition instead of relying on conversations with customers. And so this leads to misunderstanding customers and ultimately optimizing for what the company sees as valuable, not what customers see as valuable. And the way to really preserve that is to make sure that you as a PM have a competency around voice of the customer, that you really find ways to listen to that voice and to factor that voice into the decisions that you're making. And then I already talked about it, but bringing that insight of the customer into the product means understanding what is their experience and being able to work with design in order to develop a really strong experience that supports those needs. And collectively being able to understand customers quantitatively, qualitatively, and translate that into a great user experience enables you to understand and fulfill customer needs. So I'll pause there. Any other questions or comments on that? Rebecca.
Hi, thank you. A quick question for the voice of the customer. So, my organization is very big, and product is very big, and we are very far away, from the sales team, who is very close with the customers, or the field team, or the support engineers. And I just realized that most of the time it's very hard to get customer feedback.
Yeah.
And the thing is that I wouldn't say, actually, I would love to, get the customer feedback, but the things become is we as PMs need to put in a lot of the groundwork, like do a lot of initiatives, reach out to people and try to set up the process and get it in. So I think it's more like the operation side of product, like how, PM can be more empowered in getting this feedback more proactively or effectively, so that we are not, just in our own bubble and building things ourselves. And so just wonder, Ravi, your experience in such large organization, like what are some of the recommendations that could be, to solve this issue that can potentially bring back to the team?
Yeah, definitely. Tell me about your customers. Who are they? What are they trying to solve for?
Yeah, so I work at Azure Storage, and so our customers are kind of like the enterprise customers, and they touch a lot of different products, because in cloud it's not just one product specific, but it's different features they leverage in cloud. But my team just own very specific, it's storage primarily, and okay. Yeah, so that's I hope that's a good start.
Yeah, that's great. And who are the teams that are talking to customers? So you've got the sales team. Do you have a sales integration team that's talking to customers, or a customer support team?
We have sales team. They go out and try to target the enterprise customers. And we also have field team where if the customer is big enough, the field team, will sort of be tasked to work with those customers directly. Yes.
So my guess is that both the sales team and the field team doesn't feel like they have enough understanding of the product roadmap, and doesn't feel like they understand how product decisions get made and what the decision criteria is, especially if you've gotten really big and those things are pulling apart. And so like a secret weapon of product managers is you are really close to the product, and you can offer a lot of value to a sales team or a field engineering team by saying, hey, I'm trying to get closer to customers. I really want to understand what they want. I actually want to make your job easier. I want to make it so that the product is completely aligned with the messages that you're selling. Can I tag along on your next field meeting? Can I tag along on your next sales call? And I'll just be a fly on the wall. Or if you want me to, if you're getting questions that you don't know the answers to, I'll just come and I'll answer those questions. And I'll try to be as helpful as possible. And oftentimes, nobody's doing that. And so that's like a refreshing thing in an organization. It's a very personal thing too. It's a very human thing. Like people love getting help. You're going to help make them more successful in the work that they're doing. And you're going to get a closer line to customers. So that can often work very well. And then the nice thing about that, it means that you're not stepping on any toes. Because I think a lot of times when sales is talking to customers and product wants to talk to customers and they're doing it independently, there's a feeling that like, oh, I don't want the product folks talking to my customers. They're going to mess up the things that I'm doing in terms of sales or in terms of integration. If you're doing it collectively and you're going to them first and you're basically doing it through them, then they feel really empowered. They get a lot of value and you get that face time in front of the customers.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Jim, what's your question?
Two things. On the sales call thing, it's tricky. There are sales calls where they don't want you along because they're processing an order, and having a customer talk about possibilities can often stall a deal that's going down. So they get a little nervous about that. Same thing if they bring in developers and they say, here's my problem. And the developer starts saying, hey, I know how I can fix that. No. You're going to kill the deal. Don't do it. On the other hand, if you arrange with the sales rep, if they're doing just a courtesy follow-up call or something like that, or if they can use you as an example of showing how much the company supports the customers, et cetera, and schedule it that way, it can be wonderful. Yeah. And I've seen both cases go down, and definitely asking them for what you're trying to get and trying to separate a call where you're trying to close from a call that you're trying to gather insights and information. Really important to keep those separate. The other thing was on user UX design. I personally have a passion for that sort of thing. I've got some pretty good skills around it, I believe, but there's always more to learn. I've seen product managers be really successful without being very good at not having a great sense of it, but they have to have a good UX person on the team. And they have to be able to look at it and recognize where problems are, et cetera. They may not be able to design a solution to those problems, but they can at least say, wait a minute, there's too much stuff on the screen, too many things to think through. Can you simplify it some or whatever? Anyway, just some comments. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's part of this evaluation is if you evaluate yourself and you're like, that's not a skill that I have, that's not an interest that I have, then you know that this is an area where you should look for someone who's complementary and you can deliver better work if you're working in close coordination with a great designer. So one of the advantages of kind of looking at the skills this way is it'll help you understand that. And I completely agree on sales teams. I think there is potential, sales are delicate and the sales team is working really hard to close the deals and they don't want anything that's going to get in the way. But one of the things I've seen is like, there's a potential for product being in on a sales call to go wrong, but there's a potential for it to really go right. And if you're on a sales call and you say something as a PM that helps them close the deal, they'll want to bring you on every sales call. And I've talked to PMs where they've been able to get in that relationship with the sales team, or even just maybe one or two folks on the sales team. And it's really helpful. It's valuable for the sales team. It's valuable for the product team. All right, so the next area is product strategy. And so product strategy is about delivering business impact via product innovation. Product strategy is really the glue that joins product development together with company strategy. And so good product strategy requires PMs to consistently deliver features that build towards a coherent roadmap and that enable a company to achieve its overall strategy. And so this goes back to what we started with, which is our job as product managers is not to ship a roadmap of features, but instead to deliver business impact. And this consists of 3 competencies. The first one is business outcome ownership. And the color scheme on each of these slides sort of indicates the relative priority of competencies depending on your level within the organization. This is not to say that any competencies are unimportant at a particular level in an organization, but that certain competencies get highlighted at certain levels. So as you get to be more senior, you become a director, a senior director, a VP, the importance of product vision and road mapping and the importance of strategic impact becomes higher. Of all the competencies, this was the one that we said is equally important at every single level. And we made a conscious choice to do that at TripAdvisor because what we want to do is highlight that a PM's job is ultimately to own business outcomes. And we wanted to set it up so that strong PMs flock towards responsibility for the business rather than shy away from it. And they foster ownership, not only for themselves, but also for their teams. And so business outcome ownership is the ability to drive meaningful outcomes for the business by connecting product functionality and goals to the strategic objectives of the PM's team and the company overall. Product vision and road mapping is a matter of taking each of the individual features or initiatives that your team is working on and connecting them together into a highly prioritized set of features that deliver against your vision for the product. And so the last thing is strategic impact, and that's the ability to understand and contribute to the business strategy for a PM's team and the company overall, and the ability to bring strategy to fruition through consistent delivery of business outcomes. One of the questions I get often on the framework is, what's the difference between strategic impact and business outcome ownership? And I think there's sort of an analogy. So a feature is to a roadmap. So a feature is one atomic element of a broader roadmap, as a business outcome is to strategic impact. And so strategic impact is the accumulation of value from all of the different business outcomes that you've been able to deliver for the business. And delivering sort of one test that increases something by 5% or another test that increases another metric by 10%, that's owning a business outcome. But as you become a more senior product leader, it's important to aggregate those together and to be an agent for consistent, prolonged delivery of strategic value at your company by defining a roadmap that makes your company, of course, helps your company hit its revenue goals, but also makes your company an indispensable provider to your customers. And that creates defensibility, creates a moat, creates the other things that make your company harder to compete with strategically. So I'll pause there. Any questions or thoughts on product strategy as an area of competency? And then the third piece, or the fourth piece, is one that we know well. It's influencing people. And so ultimately, product management is a really interesting role. It's the only role that I can think of where on your first day on the job, you're a leader. And you have to lead not just yourself, you've got to lead your team, you've got to lead stakeholders. And so it's an inherently 360-degree leadership role. And ultimately, your ability to succeed as a product manager is related to your ability to rally people around your team's work. And so the influencing people area consists of three competencies. The first one is stakeholder management. And I think I'm actually going to change this to stakeholder inclusion, because stakeholders don't want to be managed. They want to be included. And I've seen time and time again that the really great PMs are really good at bringing people into the fold to help the team make hard product decisions, to get the team aligned around those decisions, but also to realize that good product decision-making is not a matter of compromise, that effective product decision-making is about making strongly opinionated decisions and then disagreeing and committing to those decisions. Because ultimately, if you're making compromised product decisions, you're shipping a compromised product to your customers. And so stakeholder inclusion is really about everyone having that ownership mindset and understanding that there's different perspectives. And the thing that we need to do is deliver an opinionated, effective product. The opinion might be wrong, and we're going to learn that. And we'll regroup if that's the case. But it's much better to have a strong opinion that turns out to be wrong than to have no opinion at all. And so that's a key part of stakeholder inclusion. The next one, which is a competency that begins as soon as you start managing PMs, is team leadership. Product managers have a significant amount of leadership experience by the time they start to manage their first direct reports. But that also means that PM leaders who have their first direct report, their first PM or two on their team, often fall into a trap of micromanaging their first reports. And so they'll manage the product rather than managing the people. And so it's really important for product leaders to think about themselves as a coach first and foremost, and to give their direct reports and their broader team the tools and autonomy that they need to succeed. And then the third thing that's really important, the final competency, is increasingly in today's world, the primary driver of competitive advantage is product excellence. This has changed, right? In the past, logistics and supply chain and operations were really key. And they're still key in many businesses, but in a lot of businesses, especially software-oriented businesses, they win or lose based on the strength of the product. And so the product team plays a uniquely important role at the management team level in terms of the company being successful. And the way to think about managing up is ultimately about getting the support that you need to accomplish your goals. And so peak PMs understand what their boss, what their leaders are trying to achieve, and they align their work with those objectives. And they understand that the resources in a company are going to be aligned to the things that the management team wants to accomplish. And so as a result, they think about their work in terms of that strategy, that direction, and they communicate frequently and effectively with the leadership team so that they can understand the work that their PMs are doing. So those are the 12 competencies that are an essential part of being a peak product manager. I want to do a quick time check. When do we go until, Tom?
We typically can run up to the top of the hour, so we can run up till 8 Pacific with questions and whatnot. So we're not out of time.
All right, that sounds good. So I was going to ask folks here, but I want to kind of save the time. But think about for yourself, like, of these 12 competencies, what's one competency that you excel at the most? And what competency do you want to invest in over the next year? And I ask it that way because it's not what's one competency that you excel at and what's one weakness. Because ultimately, oftentimes, the thing that makes you a uniquely great PM is not necessarily spending a bunch of time on the things where you're weak or the things where you don't get enjoyment or fulfillment. It's from really acknowledging your strengths, identifying them, and really investing in them. That's not always the case. Sometimes there's gaps that you need to fill, but it's important to think about, where do you excel the most? What's your spike? And then what do you want to invest in over the next year? Do you want to invest on continuing to hone that thing that you're spiky at? Or do you want to, is there a particular area that needs focus and you want to spend time there?
There's a great analogy I ran across some years ago called the tent pole effect, and it's the story was that if one person looks and they say, well, this they've got one tent pole, which is a spike, as you mentioned, of some skill that they have developed to an extreme level, but they worry about the other spots, and so they start building more tent poles. And so you wind up with folks that have 50-foot tent poles, and everybody says, wow, look at that. This is the acknowledged expert in this one skill set. And then you have people that have 40, 6-foot tall tent poles, and they kind of blend into the crowd at times, but they're a good all-arounder. And so that's another way to kind of put that in a metaphor.
I really like that metaphor. I haven't heard that before. And yeah, if you invest in a lot of different tent poles, you no longer have a tent, right? You just have a piece of cloth that's above the ground. Versus if you have a tent pole, you've got something that is sort of unique and defensible.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Love that. So one of the things that we can do with the competencies, and this I think goes towards the tent pole analogy really nicely, is look at them on a spider graph and start to evaluate yourself on the competencies. And one of the things I like to encourage people to do is not to think too hard, right? We don't need to evaluate ourselves on a 100-point scale. If you can just really quickly in 5 minutes evaluate yourself for each competency in terms of what's something that I'm on track on, what's an area where I'm outperforming, and what's an area that needs focus, you can quickly start to see a shape of things and get a feel for how you as a product manager show up every day to work. What are areas that could be your tentpole spike that you have that you bring value to, and what are areas where you have some deficiencies and either you want to spend some time closing that gap or you want to work with people that are really complementary. And one of the reasons that this way of thinking is important is something that feels like common sense in the grand scheme of things, but we often forget. In 2011, McKinsey and a recruiting firm named Egan Zehnder did a survey of 5,000 people, and they wanted to understand the differences between rapidly growing companies and the rest of the pack. And consistently, what they found was that the highest performing companies were average or even deficient at a lot of important leadership competencies, whereas the average companies really focused on building well-rounded leaders. And so what they found is that the outlier companies recognize that exceptional people do their best work when they're encouraged to be exceptional in the areas that they're great at. They also recognize that the people that are exceptional at certain things often have weaknesses in mirror image to their strength. And if you ask them to spend all of their attention on their weaknesses, they're not going to take advantage of the things that they're exceptional at. Versus like the industry trend is to sort of say, here's 3 development areas. Let's focus on these three development areas. And the focus of every quarter from a performance review standpoint is always the things that you're not great at versus the things that you're really great at. And the key idea that came out of this is that individuals should be spiky and ultimately teams can be well-rounded. So if you have spiky people, you can get people together that have complementary spikes and all of a sudden have a team that isn't just well-rounded, but is actually great at a lot of things. And so in order to really identify that, you need to understand your shape, and you can use this product competency framework to help you do that. And so I'll go through a couple of things to help you identify your shape. So let's say after this, and I have on my website, I have a downloadable pack with a worksheet that you can draw on, and that goes into these competencies in more detail. Once you've drawn out your shape, you can start to interpret it. And one of the ways to do that is to look at the shape in terms of 2 hemispheres. So we have a Western hemisphere and we have an Eastern hemisphere. And the competencies on the Western hemisphere are really builder competencies. These are the things that enable you to take an idea and turn it into a functioning product. So this is product execution and influencing people. And a lot of companies that have teams that they want to become more product oriented, but are executing really well, might have folks that are doing essentially a project management role. They're connective tissue within the organizations. They're good at writing specs. They're good at delivering on those specs. But the thing that they're missing is the ability to really architect the product. And so the imperfect analogy I like to use here is if you're building a house, you need both an architect as well as a contractor. And so if you only focus on the builder skills and you don't focus enough on the architecture skills, you might be great at building things, but you might be building the wrong thing. On the Eastern side of things, we have the architecture skills. And these are really an important part of understanding what you need to build. What's the customer insight that's driving this? What's the business strategy that's driving this? And equally, if you spend all of your time in customer insight and strategy, but don't have the foundational skills to build, you'll have a really strong strategy that you'll never be able to execute. And so this way of looking at the skills can help you understand what's your orientation. Are you more oriented towards a builder, or are you more oriented towards architecture? And as a result, what should that mean in terms of your personal development, especially as you get more senior? Because as you get more senior, the architecture pieces tend to come into sharper focus. The second thing that we can do is we can look at this in terms of a Northern hemisphere and a Southern hemisphere. The top half of the competencies are really product manager competencies, and they're very important when you're at the earlier stages of your product career, the things that you need to do to move up within the organization is you need to be able to build great product, you need to be able to execute, and you need to be able to talk to customers and understand what customers need from individual features. As you become more senior, you start to then think about your work, not just in terms of specific features, but in terms of a roadmap of features, and not just in terms of individual business outcomes, but in terms of the overall strategic impact that you want to have. And so product leaders starting at kind of senior PM, GPM, and into director start to focus more on kind of winding their way around these competencies and really developing their product strategy skills, as well as developing and expanding their leadership skills. And so one of the things that is helpful is there's a couple of archetypes. As I've looked around, I've met a lot of product managers. There tends to be clusters of skills that operate together. This isn't always the case. Everyone is unique, but I wanted to put some of these archetypes in here so that you can kind of see these archetypes that exist in the industry and understand and how you compare, and then how people on your team or others may compare. And so one of the archetypes that I often see is a product innovator. This is someone who's thinking a lot about product market fit, is really good at talking to customers, really good at user design, really good at specifying features, often has a big vision for what they want to accomplish, but sometimes might be lacking in terms of data. They may often rely on intuition. They may also be lacking on delivery and quality assurance. So they may be a big innovative thinker, but they just don't have the set of execution skills that they really need. And because of that gap in terms of data and execution, although they may have a really innovative idea of where the product may go, they may not be able to drive strategic impact with that because they're not able to connect those innovative ideas with the needs of the business. And these are archetypes. Like, this is not meant to sort of be a description of any one person. It's just kind of common patterns that I see. The other shape, you can see is kind of the growth hacker. This is someone who executes incredibly fast. They're constantly looking at data. They're constantly running experiments. You give them a metric to hit, and they're going to hit that metric. But in the process of doing that, of being a very experimentally driven growth hacker, they start to move the numbers rather than cater to the customers. And so here you may have someone who's great at business outcome ownership, product delivery, fluency with data, but someone who might be weaker on voice of the customer, may not be having enough customer conversations. Someone who might be more focused on, does this interface convert, rather than, is it valuable and understandable to users? They may not have a clear vision in mind. Their idea of a vision may be run 100 experiments, not this is ultimately the destination that we want to work towards. These folks, because they deliver value for the business pretty consistently and they're very metrics oriented, tend to be great at managing up, but sometimes they may not be as inclusive as they need to be with stakeholders or with other people on the team. Another common archetype is the project manager who's now in a product management role. And they start thinking about their role really in terms of product management. My job is to deliver software, and my job is to manage the stakeholders that are included in that process of delivering software. But in focusing so much on delivery, they may not spend enough time on understanding the customer, understanding the business strategy, and connecting all of those pieces together. And then the final archetype that I wanted to share with you is the people manager. So this is someone who's just great at managing people. You can put them in front of anyone. They'll do a great job of understanding those person's motivations, helping them figure out how to accomplish their work. And they do a great job of including stakeholders, leading their team, building a high performance team, working with leadership. And that actually gives them an advantage in terms of being able to deliver product effectively. And because they can deliver a lot of product, because they're great people leaders, they can start to deliver on business outcomes. But oftentimes these really great leaders who haven't spent time on the craft of product management might be lacking in terms of data analytics, or might be lacking in terms of user experience design or voice of the customer. And so they really excel at the leadership side of things, but they need to understand that product leaders build both people and they build products. And so it's really important for these people leaders to think about that craft of product and start to become more strategically oriented and more customer oriented. And so the last thought that I'll leave everyone with, and then we'll do open Q&A, is one of the interesting things that's happening in product right now is we just talked about how incredibly broad this role is. And in some respects, it's impossibly broad. And analogously, engineering used to be like this. We used to have all full stack engineers, but over time, the technology got so complicated that you couldn't have someone who was a master at a full stack anymore. And there needed to be specialization in terms of front end or back end in order to get teams that operate really well. I think we're starting to see that same specialization happen in product, not in as official and defined a way, but in some really interesting and organic ways. And this is from a post on Reforge that I contributed to, which talks about sort of 4 pillars of specialty within product management. One is the core PM, who's very focused on features, often working on like specific areas of the product, such as newsfeed or international or specific features. Then you have the growth PM, who works in a very data-driven way and who's often responsible not for specific feature areas, but for specific outcomes for the business, like activation or acquisition or engagement. Then you have the platform PMs who aren't necessarily responsible for the front end parts of the product, but are playing an essential role in terms of creating all of the back end infrastructure necessary to run a business at scale. That could be technical architecture, data architecture, or trust and safety architecture. Increasingly, there's a whole set of people focused on personalization, recommendation algorithms, machine learning. So really important things that fuel the rest of the business and the product. And then lastly, you have the innovation PMs who are really focused on how do we move from 0 to 1? How do we generate product market fit? If we're in a business that already has product market fit, how do we expand that product market fit by moving into new verticals or new initiatives or new markets? So one of the things that you can do after you've done this analysis of yourself and you've assessed yourself is understand, based on the things that I'm great at, based on the things I love to do, what's the right specialty for me? And it could be that you say, I want to be someone who's cross-functional. I want to have that optionality. That's totally fine. Or it could be that because of the way you work, but because of the way you operate, you get your most fulfillment from some of these specific product roles here. So with that, I know we've only got 2 minutes left. We can do a couple of quick questions if we have time.
Yeah, and if you're like, we don't have a hard stop, so we if we've got a few minutes extra for a really compelling question, that's not an issue. We won't suddenly get hung up on one term you had there. You had third horizon. I'd never seen that before. What's that about? Third horizon PM on the far right.
Yeah, I can. So I contributed to the article. I didn't write the whole thing. I can find out what that means. I think what that's referring to is you have vertical expansion, you have horizontal expansion, and there might be like, actually there's a third horizon, there's a third way that you can expand as a business, but I can confirm that.
I believe the third horizon refers to, you got the short term, looking at 1 to 2 years, then you got a 2 to 5 year vision, and what's beyond that. How do you look at technology, how that meets with your product? So you need some other technology to mature before you can bring that into the product. That's where the PM is looking 5 to 10 years ahead. But it's not really so much on the PM's domain at that point of time. I think it's more on the someone a little bit more senior in the product who's looking at the product strategy and vision. But again, that's something that if you're PM of one in a company, then yeah, you're probably looking at all 3 horizons, right?
Yeah, that's great. I think you're right. I think I was mistaken.
Cool.
Chris Lee is echoing the time thing.
What was that, Jim?
Chris Lee was echoing that time thing, suggesting McKinsey.
Got it. Okay, cool. That's great.
Well, let's let Mohan go first.
Yeah.
Mohan here. Ravi, are you seeing these verticals are interchanging? Like one person is maybe core for 5 years and growth for 2 years, something like that, or people are kind of segregating in this 4 bucket?
I think there's still optionality, right? I think there's still the ability to move between these pretty easily, because oftentimes these aren't well defined, but there are some areas where I think it's getting better defined. So for example, I think that there is a set of product managers who are growth product managers, and they've built their career around growth. And so their natural next role is a growth role. And they have to think very actively about, do I want to move out of growth? I was talking to someone recently who's in a growth leadership role, and his question was like, am I going to get pigeonholed in growth, or should I take on some product work in order to have that kind of cross-functional aspect to my career, or cross-specialty aspect to my career? And I don't think it has to be one or the other. I really think it's about what you want. There are extremely successful people that focus particularly on growth and move up in that area, and that specialty is rare and valuable. And there's also people that, yeah, they don't want to specialize in that. They want to work across all these specialties, and they might decide that their spike is less around these specialties and more around a domain. Like, I'm going to be really focused on fintech, for example, or it might be a stage. Like, I'm going to operate at Series B stage or something like that. So I think one of the interesting things about product careers is there is a lot of optionality, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it lets you kind of steer to where you want to go, but it can be a bad thing as you make these career decisions because there is so much choice. And if you don't think about it in terms of where you want to go over a 5 or 10 year horizon, then you could find that you've had a sort of sampling of different roles, but haven't had the forward momentum in the direction that you wanted.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Tim, what's your question?
It's not so much a question as much as an observation. I really like your spider plots and the way you slice and diced it. That's a really interesting way to think about things. It reminded me of the old crossing the chasm thing, which ends up getting kind of complicated if you're managing a portfolio of products where some are at a nascent stage and some are at a mature stage, because the competencies you need to, or the behaviors you need to have in terms of ignoring customer ship as fast as possible versus customer intimacy is a discipline you would have in a more mature market. In the same way, I'm thinking that some of these competencies and the way you're slicing that spider plot could be challenging to think about if you're just doing one product, one fundamental product, that's great. But if you got a suite of products and they're at different stages of maturity, that could get really interesting and complicated. So I was just seeing the analogy between those two situations. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It's it touches on like, what is your job as you become more senior? And so like, as an early product manager, your job is to build the product. As a sort of mid-level product leader, your job is to build the team that builds the product. And as a very senior product executive, your job is to build the systems that build the team that build the product.
Yeah.
And so I think that when you look at a multi-product portfolio, these competencies are really instructive, not because of individual work that you're doing, but in terms of how you systematize. So how do you systematize user experience design? How do you systematize product vision and road mapping within your organization based on the things that are really important to your particular company and the way that it gets to strategic value?
There you go. Well said. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Brings up another interesting thought around, as you climb up to more and more senior levels or the organization gets more mature, whether some of the rings pull in or push out a little bit in terms of, how much of this do you need to be acceptable, or, delivering on target, and delivering on target at that particular skill gets further out or requires more skill as the organization matures or as you go up the ladder.
Yeah, I actually have a chart. Let me pop out of this for a sec.
And meantime, while you look beside it, people have other questions, go ahead and raise your hands in the Zoom thing, and we'll get you in the queue here.
And I'll pull that up real quick, but I'm happy to take another question.
Anyone else?
So this is a bit of an eyesore, this chart, but the idea here is that it's highlighting not the relative importance by the level that you're at. And so what you find often is that there's a certain set of things that are really important for an APM. And this is, of course, it's going to vary by company and by circumstance. But for APMs, like the things that they need to focus on are very execution oriented. And at TripAdvisor, we felt like outcome ownership was really important, that was something that was critical as soon as a person starts within the organization. And then it expands out as you get to be a PM and a senior PM role. And actually, I think one of the most challenging roles within any company and within a person's career is at the GPM level, because you're both someone who's responsible for individual contribution of your product and the people on your teams, the product that they're working on, but you're also starting to engage really heavily in the strategy and in managing up and understanding, what is the things that your team is supposed to accomplish for the business. And so GPMs are often kind of the connective tissue between day-to-day execution and senior leadership strategy. So it's actually a pretty demanding role. And then as you move into director, senior director, and eventually CPO, the relative emphasis tends to get more focused on the bottom half, the product leadership competencies. But very importantly, this is not to say that any of these are unimportant. As we were talking about with Jim, like the systems become really important. So for example, the relative emphasis on product quality is not high for a CPO. A CPO is not expected to go in and test the software, but a CPO is expected to make sure that the systems are there so that the team is testing the software so that high quality product gets out into the world. And if ultimately high quality product's not getting out into the world, then there's a systems problem that the CPO then needs to go into and solve. And even at a more senior level, I think VPs and chief product officers need to have the dynamic range to do that. It's not that senior product executives kind of sit in their ivory tower and think only strategically. As we talked about with the Steve Jobs example and some other user interface examples, the individual details matter. The crash rate matters, the way that a UI is exposed matters, and those things might seem like execution issues, but they can be strategy issues in certain contexts.
Fascinating. No, this is a great tool. Did you want to let people know your website address?
Yeah, let me do that. Let me.
Okay. And we've got one more
I
question.
can paste it in the chat. Nick's got a question.
Nick, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Ravi, this is great. I discovered this through Reforge and been actually digging into it to help me figure out like my next stop in my career.
Nice.
One of the articles, I think one of your writings may have been on your site, you talked about the how product management varies from industry to industry and company to company. And I'm just curious, and since developing this framework, I can see the ties to like the companies that you worked at, the TripAdvisor and so on. I've got my start in hardware and consumer electronics, and I've done software and services as well. I'm just curious, in since crafting this and publicizing it and working with people, can you speak to about like are you seeing the same trends in other industries in this framework in terms of how applicable it is? In some other, in other industries that are outside the Metas and the Googles and the Tinders and the TripAdvisors of the world.
Yeah, so I have seen a lot of applicability. One of the things that I hear a lot is, our company really values a scientific mindset, or we really obsess about customers, or we really focus on team collaboration, or we're focused on diversity and inclusion. And I think one of the ways to think about that is there's a set of things that the set of skills, behaviors, and competencies that your company might really value, but you can think about those as orthogonal to this, right? If you really want to think about, this is really not meant to be a competency model for a company. This is meant to be a competency model for the product management role in particular. And some of these are going to bleed over into things that are mission driven or value driven or culture driven in a company. Some are going to be completely orthogonal to it. And so it can coexist with whatever other systems your company is using to define roles. So for example, the values at Facebook are like focus on impact, move fast. And those values can exist completely orthogonally to this. And you can evaluate people on those, you can evaluate yourself on those, but you can also have this as a toolkit to be able to understand specifically my role as a product manager, what are areas that I need to focus on or build on. And so I often encourage people, rather than saying like, we need to completely change this for their particular context, is instead to reinterpret some of these. So these are deliberately positioned so that they're broader. So user experience design, not user interface design, product. I changed quality assurance. I changed it to product quality because product quality is a more broad term. And so, it does have a lot of applicability, but absolutely you should, all of the stuff is available on my site. I've got like a spreadsheet of expectations by level for competency. All of that is free for folks to use and to customize for their orgs. The reason I say to try to like fit within the model first is to understand what's truly different about your company so that you can be really sharp about that. And maybe something about your company doesn't fit here and you say very explicitly, we're changing this. And that's a good way to highlight that versus to potentially pull in other things that you're solving.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yep.
Yeah,
Maybe-
any follow-ons on that? It's a good
I was gonna
question.
say, maybe we've got one final question we've got in the chat, which I think is a great kind of extension of the takeaway actions and things to do. Michael had asked for folks that weren't fortunate to land in a company with the 2-year rotation program, like you mentioned, if they go through the toolkit and they're looking at, well, here's my current shape as I've defined with the toolkit. How do they seek out kind of opportunities to grow, or like any advice on, okay, well, I'm weak in these spots or I'm strong in these spots? How do mid-career professionals then look to develop their competencies and transition up to the next role?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of resources now. It's actually a really good time to be a product manager. There's a lot of cohort-based courses, books, podcasts. There were some really good books that were mentioned at the beginning of this. I want to eventually put together a list of resources for each one of the competencies. I just haven't had time to do that. But I would look at what are the competencies that you want to invest in, and then you can often go to really good thinkers in products, so whether it's Lenny Rachitsky or Andrew Chen or others, and they'll have a lot of depth in particular competency areas that you can benefit from. And so, there's a lot of value in just being able to identify these areas. And then once you have that direction, there's really good resources. I know my answer is not as specific as possible. I can also follow up with some suggestions. I think Reforge is a good place to go. There's a product strategy program. There's a program recently on product market fit that just got launched. There's an amazing program on data for product managers. So that's often the first place that I suggest. There's a lot of good material on Reforge too that's just available within their blog, which is a really good place to start. And then there's so many great product influencers and creators like Lenny and Andrew that are publishing really good work really consistently. So for me, I think I've found it's more a matter of figuring out where to focus than it is on getting great information and guidance in those areas. At the same time, I'm very accessible. If you do this and you're like, I want to grow in this area and I'm not sure how to do it, just reach out to me and I can provide some suggestions.
Excellent. Well, I think everyone got really judging from the comments here, like there's a huge virtual round of applause going on in the Zoom room at the moment. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. This was really, really helpful and a good way to look at ourselves as well as our teams. If you in the audience missed part of this, or you realize that you have some coworkers or colleagues or friends that really could benefit from this presentation, but they weren't free on a Wednesday, we plan to get this posted within a few weeks to our YouTube channel, so keep an eye out for that. Also keep an eye on the SVPMA website and or mailing list as we look to potentially have a social get together as kind of first steps to get some face-to-face therapy, PM therapy. With that, we will see you soon, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to meet everyone.